looking at laying out this bow, that knot is closest to this edge, so if I make that the arrow pass, and traditionally you'd have the centre of the bow 1 inch below that, but if I make it say 2 inches below that, that will just give me a little bit more length to play with. So if I say that's the centre, that gives me about 33 inches to that tip, which gives me 33 to there, which means I only waste that little bit. If you assume the grip is sort of 4 inches deep, then that's pretty much the centre of the bow is pretty much in the middle of the stave, and the arrow pass is a wee bit higher. I have made bows without measuring them and inadvertently ended up with a lower limb that was substantially longer than the upper, and it actually shot really sweetly, one of the best bows I've ever made. So there's no reason why I couldn't leave that lower limb longer. So, but it doesn't hurt to cut it a bit shorter because it will alleviate some of this bend. Although to be fair, it's swinging back that way at the very tip. But that's what I'll work on anyway. I'll saw off that little bit off the end, but I tend to saw, instead of sawing there, always allow an extra inch. So I'll just lose a little bit off there. I'll trim out some of the obvious thick points and just see if I can get it moving on the tiller a little bit, just to have a look at it. This isn't going to be one of those 8 or 9 part videos. This will be more like 2 or 3 or 4. But you can see that was my thin point that was the limiting factor. So you can still see the saw marks there. I've barely touched that. But I've removed a lot off the belly either side to try and give me some sort of even taper. Still a bit thick at the tip. And I've chopped out a lot of wood here, well, with a draw knife, not an axe. And I'm trying to thin it substantially here. Well, obviously the risk is that it will break there, but remember that's in compression, so I'm going to take off as much as I dare to try and get as much working limb on this upper limb as possible. So now I'll basically mark out a grip area and then do a similar thing on this limb, getting rid of the high points. You can see there's my limiting thin area on this limb. Do something similar, so I've got, you know, a similar tapered limb either end. Slap a string on it and see what it does on the tiller. Right, doing that was quite hard work on my elbows and fingers because I'm a bit arthritis-y these days. So I'm going to freehand some of it on the bandsaw, and it may or may not be interesting for you to see how I do it. It'll be very noisy with the fan on, so I'll probably mute the sound. Anyway, here we go. there. That's taken quite a bit of bulk off. You know, that would be the fade area and some of the bulk around the knotty bits. Hopefully you could see the technique there, where I'd work off a corner, then the opposite corner, leaving a ridge down the middle. Because if you try and go straight through and reduce all the thickness at once, what looked good this side, you can find you run out of wood this side. So always better to do one edge than the other. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not a pretty bow limb yet, but I've removed a lot of bulk, and the draw knife's pretty quick. I can do some more with the draw knife, tidy that up and see about getting it on the tiller. This sideways bend, what I'll do is I'll thin it out at the grip, I'll narrow it at the grip so I can do any sideways correction there, but it's not essential early. Before I prop it up on the tiller, you can see it's looking so much prettier now. We've still got the big sideways bend, but if you look at this wood, it just gives a lie to the stuff that people talk about, oh, landscape yew and domestic yew and what have you. Those rings, they're not stupidly tight, but they're not stupidly coarse. The colour of the wood's gorgeous, the definition of heartwood and sapwood's beautiful. Yeah, it's got a lot of knots in it, but I didn't pretend it was a perfect bit of yew. I'm just trying to show what you can do with a yew stick. It might explode. I don't profess to know everything about everything. I'm just showing you what I do. As one of my mates once said, your opinion, Del, comes in two flavours. Take it or leave it. But yeah, I'm also a great exponent of, I'm always saying, don't shape the handle early. But I just thought I'd do this just to give you an idea of how the handle sits relative to those big knots. And also, if I'm going to have to do some sideways bend, I've got to narrow it so that's where it can bend. After the bandsaw, I've gone through it with a draw knife, taking out any thick points. There's one there, could do with a little bit more work. But this is just so I can have a quick shufty on the tiller. A couple of temporary knot grooves there. And with no further ado, let's get her on the tiller and have a look. Notice I haven't touched the back at all. Right, that long string's a bit longer than I'd like, but I was struggling to get it onto the nocks. And before I pull it, let's try for some predictions. I reckon it'll be much too stiff, a lot stiffer than wanted. I think this limb will be weaker, which will be right because it's the upper limb, but the upper limb had to be there because of this big knot. It may try and flip sideways because of the huge bend on it, but let's have a little look. Oh no, left limb's weaker by the look of it. You can hear the bark popping. This funny left limbs, I won't bend it much more because it's, I don't want to overstress it. Right, well my predictions are all totally wrong. So it looks like it's bending hideously here, but in actual fact that's a bit of a natural deflex bend. But we're pulling, I was almost pulling 40 there, it's about 35. So strange that that right limb's not shifting. Anyway, there we go, that's what it was. Yeah, I couldn't resist giving it another quick tickle with the draw knife and a bit of a go on the bandsaw just here, trying to relieve this and try and get this limb moving some more. So let's just see if that's made any difference. Aha, that's nice. You see the bark popping off here, that shows it's actually flexing there. That's an advantage of keeping the bark on. It gives us a pristine surface there. So we can see, despite it looking like all the bends there, this is actually flexing there. the way it's sat on the tiller, I've moved this across a bit to try and line up with the arrow pass, which makes it sit like that, which makes this funny deflex look really weird. But overall it's sitting there a bit straighter. But it is a deceptive business when you've got a character stave or something. So look, viewed like that, if you don't let your eye, just ignore that for a minute. Don't let that throw you. And just look at that right limb. That right limb is moving a bit, but not a lot, but it is moving. And it is moving, funnily enough, where the bark popped off. So it's nature's strain gauge. So I can leave that, work the way out from here, and we'll end up with something that moves evenly. Let's just have a look. So that's 30, isn't it? That's 30 at about 24. So, but do you remember what I did on that lower limb? Left it an inch longer than necessary. If I take an inch off that, it'll effectively stiffen it, and instead of the centre being 2 inches below the arrow pass, I can bring it back up to the usual 1 inch above the arrow pass. So it's even at this stage I'm fiddling and fettling and trying to adjust, trying to get the best out of the bow. I mean, at the moment you could put a string on it and shoot it. I mean, it looks pretty hideous. But at the end of it, I think if I heat treat and take some of this bend out, maybe there as well, it could end up looking pretty. You have to be an optimist to be a bowyer. That'll do.